Want to play yet? All right, let's go ahead and get started. Since nobody wants to listen to suicidal tendencies or agnostic front, we'll just move on to this stuff. We have been talking about classical Hollywood cinema. We have talked about the ways in which it came to its birth at the rise of the sound era in 1927 and its almost entire dominance by 1929. We've talked about it as a business oriented as a vertical integrated system in which the studios controlled absolutely every aspect of a film's production. We've also talked about it aesthetically as something that operates predominantly by what we're calling the invisible style. Right, that all elements of the aesthetics, all the artistic choices that go into filming any given scene are all at the service of the film's story. We watch clips of that to see, several clips to see examples of the ways in which Hollywood's mechanisms go to hide its telling, right? The telling function is all hidden. Today what we're going to do is to explore types of content of those films, right? So the fourth way in which we're talking about it now is in terms of content. If after the evolution, or pardon me, the opening up of the silent talkie era, rather, in the latest 1920s, earliest 1930s, fell into a pattern, so that if you worked as a director, as a studio director for Paramount or MGM or Universal, you were given a manual as to how to edit, how to use lighting, how to use costumes, how to use color. Again, even in black and white, right? Color stands out. Gray stands out differently than does white, than does brown or black, right? All of those choices were already made for you in a real way. So that classical Hollywood, the dominant mode of classical Hollywood, really did not look for individual signatory styles. That even in the guy we're going to talk about on Thursday, we're going to talk about two directors on Thursday. One is Howard Hawks. We're going to call him the master of the invisible style. He is the most, what we might call, deceptively artless, right? That in focusing on that invisible style by hiding all of the aesthetics, it looks as if there is no art to it, as if the reality is just unfolding in front of you. We're also going to look at Orson Welles, who is going to stand in stark contrast to this dominant mode, because his film, we're only going to watch clips from one of his films called Citizen Kane, and we're going to watch a whole bunch of those clips, highly artistic, so we're going to show how he is enigmatic of the classical Hollywood dominant mode. Well, today we're going to look at a clip, at least one clip from Howard Hawks. We're going to check out a couple of more on Thursday as that dominant mode of the invisible style. But also we're going to claim about Howard Hawks was that he was the master of genre. That if you survey people like me, film historians, and said, what is the best genre, what is the best film in the prison genre? What is the best film in the crime genre, in the newspaper genre, in the Western, in the screwball comedy, in the war film? You might find that Howard Hawks has directed a candidate for the greatest of all of those genres. That is, he was able to take that invisible style across different types of stories that he was telling. So what we're going to be doing today, though, is focusing on three particular genres. The war, we're going to start at the bottom, as the war film, then work through screwball comedy and film noir. But if we just generally think about what we mean by genre, pardon me, let me back up from that just a little bit. If we talked about classical Hollywood as a dominant style that transcends the types of stories that are being told, if those things became patterned and formulaic, that as you watch classical Hollywood movie, you might like or love exactly the same thing, right? I don't like that because it's so obvious. I don't like classical Hollywood because the stories and the storytelling are so blatantly clear and you don't have to think through those things. Or simultaneously, you could absolutely love that stuff. You could appreciate that it reconfirms exactly the same story patterns and myths of American society for you. Similarly, just as that style fell into a patterned way of telling, so too did stories. They became very much programmed and formalized in a way that in the 21st century we have a much more difficult time recognizing. So if we consider it falling into if stories fell into certain patterns, we can think about those things as particular genres. That is, stories that are marked by formulas, patterns, and that sort of thing. I can hear you, and it's really driving me nuts. You're right, and people in front of you. That those stories fell into recognizable patterns, that in any given genre, there were very clear markers as to what characters could do, what types of elements the story could follow, what types of challenges, problems, and conflicts could arise in any given story. So in the 21st century, we have a very hard time thinking about genre, in large part because of what we could call the Tarantino effect. That in watching Pulp Fiction for the very first time, you found yourself laughing at highly charged moments that in no other film had you ever laughed at. When John Travolta turns around in the car, Samuel L. Jackson is driving, to ask the dude in the back seat a question, and wham, he shoots Marvin's face off. If you watched it, right? He blows Marvin's face all across the back seat of this car. You laugh instantly at a moment in which you would never laugh at any other, right? In the real world, there's nothing comedic about, at least I hope that's the way you feel about that sort of stuff. There's nothing comedic about that at all, but you certainly haven't seen another movie that had done that for you. Certainly a almost mainstream Hollywood film. What Tarantino does throughout Pulp Fiction and does masterfully, or more completely, whether or not you like it is another story, through Kill Bill, is blend genres so much that there stop being genres. There's no genre, in a way, for Clint Eastwood, the most obvious genre director today. But with Tarantino, there's almost as if there's no genre. It blends screwball comedy, crazy characters in impossible situations, right? I mean, that John Travolta, Samuel L. Jackson's characters exist at all in a movie is highly reminiscent of what I'm going to say about screwball comedy, and that this is exceedingly far-fetched, madcap sort of story goes along that's unbelievably also comedic at the same time that it's incredibly tragic, that there's violence and death and all sorts of mixed elements that in a clearer time, a clearer understanding of genre, through the classical time period would never have happened. That the modes, the ways in which we think about genre, say the Western, or the science fiction movie that's going to become very popular in the 1950s, the first rise of science fiction films, the screwball comedy and other elements, they would never have crossed those generic boundaries, right? So when we use the word generic, in English, in the States rather, we tend to use it inappropriate, or incorrectly really, to say that's very generic, as if it's bland and saccharine and not very, doesn't have much style or flavor to it. But generic means that it refers to conventions and codes that categorize the types of stories that are being told. So when I say generic conventions, I don't mean bland, thoughtless, tasteless, artless sort of things. I mean that they're coded clearly by particular genres. So we could spend today talking about the Western or the musical or other types of very clear-cut genres that in the late 20th, first part of the 21st century just really don't exist as clear-cut genres in that way. So let's start off with a war film, I suppose. So if you recognize, or if you recall, that in talking about classical Hollywood cinema, we said that as the result of a moral backlash, as the gangster film in the 1920s and then certainly into the 1930s becomes increasingly popular, as people become concerned about the content of movies, the Hollywood studios create what they call the Hays Office, that then rolls into the Production Code Administration, which was the list of do's and don'ts, things that you cannot have in the movies, or things that you have to have in the movies. So not only can you not have certain words like guts and nerds, and violence must always be very, very quick. There must be no discussion of marriage as anything, as any sort of sexual relationship at all. There was also a list of do's. That is, if the movie is about crime and criminality, the criminal must in some way pay for his crime life. either by death, and at the end of crime movies in the 1930s, the criminal often in the very last minute of the movie drove off a cliff, right? As the result of him trying to get away from his last bank robbery or something like that. That is, his death had to be the direct result of that criminal activity. It's a moral thing in that. At the end of a movie called Detour, we have a character who's been accidentally involved in some deaths of other characters, walking away with his voiceover, walking out of LA, voiceover telling about this story that just happened, and the credits roll at the end. He's walking away, and the credits roll. Well, when they submitted it to the production code, they made them change one thing. Have I brought that up before? They made them change one thing. Now, the same guy walking down the same road with the same voiceover happens, and a cop car pulls up. Cops open the door and go, "Get in, buddy." And he gets into the car. Now the credits roll, right? His criminal, that he was involved in crime, it had to come to an end, right? Justice, in that sense, had to be preserved. So if that's happening through the production code as well as Hollywood attempting, we call it self-policing, to keep the government out of film production. Remember, government is not directly involved in in any sort of censorship here. When the film is submitted to a ratings board, even today, that's not a government entity that is doing the rating system. It is, in effect, hired hands who decide if something is PG, PG-13, R, G, whatever it happens to be, right? And so out of that same moment that is strong, the production code is strongly in effect, Hollywood, the government is then going to go to Hollywood and ask them to get involved in World War II. In the run-up to the United States involvement in World War II. One of the clips that we'll watch on Thursday from His Girl Friday is going to have a character who's a newspaper publisher, and he's going to be talking to his editor on the phone and telling him to change the front page of the next day's newspaper. I don't care about that story. I don't care about whatever that. I don't care about the European War, he's going to call it. 1941. 1941, the film comes out, and a character in a movie calls it the European War, right? It's not our war in 1940 time period. Indeed, if your American history or world history textbooks look back at World War II, often the stories that we take away are epitomized by Tom Brokaw's book of that time period, which is called The Greatest Generation. That we indeed look back at the generation who went to war in World War II as nothing but this heroic moment in which America stepped forward, both in response to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, when the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor. Anyone call my bluff on that? Yeah. No, you're not even paying attention. What movie is that from? Name the movie I just quoted. When the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor. Animal House? Yeah, see, John Belushi, right, when he's trying to rally his fraternity to go do something, right, he goes, "Did we give up when the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor?" And everyone's like, "What?" And you were going to let me just go with that. Anyway, right, we look back at that generation saying, we responded when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and look at the butt kicking that we did over in Europe in response to that. It fails to recognize that it was a long time, that World War II, that the Holocaust, that concentration camps were running in Europe before America ever got involved. Indeed, in many movies and newsreels in the 1937, 1938, 40 time period, it is called the Jewish problem, their war, the war over there, the European war, right? It took a long time to get America involved, no matter how we look back at the moment as the greatest generation sort of thing. Well, without question, the most significant reason that America gets involved in the European war is because the government gets involved, gets Hollywood involved in changing of public sentiment. There was an office, I believe it was called the Office of Public Opinion, a governmental office called that. Today, I think we just call it the media. True, right? There was an Office of Government of Public Opinion. There was also a Secretary of War. Today, he is called the Secretary of Defense. There hasn't been a she Secretary of Defense, has there? Madeleine Albright, she was Secretary of State. There's not been. Now we call it the Secretary of Defense, right? But back then it was actually called the Secretary of War. You know that in 1979, 1980, when Jimmy Carter was president, and then Ronald Reagan made his second run for the presidency, that one of the reasons that, significant reasons that Ronald Reagan was able to win is because he was able to portray Jimmy Carter as a wimp, right? He was not responding to the hostage crisis. There was a 458 day, I think, somewhere right around there, hostage. Iranians were holding some Americans hostage crisis, and then other issues going on, obviously, on in the Middle East, significantly around the issue of Israel. And at one time, Jimmy Carter asked the question during a debate, why don't we have a Secretary of Peace? Right? Which, by all accounts, is a legitimate question. I don't mean that that means there needs to be a cabinet position on that, but it's a legitimate question. And in that debate, Ronald Reagan crushed him, made him look like a wimp. Why would you ever have that? That's not America. Ugh. Right? What does the billboard outside of this sports center here say for the ROTC? Join America's team, right? As if it were the Falcons. Which anyway, right? All right, so Secretary of War at that time, Office of Public Opinion, the Office of War Information, which is now called the media also. Right? Do you ever get that when they bring out the litany of generals and retired, government, and it always says retired on it, and they're so pro-war, they're just like ready to go at Iran at any given moment, or even disregarding did you hear what happened on Sunday in Afghanistan? American military went in and killed 16 people, execution style, just like we did in 1968 in the village of My My in Cambodia, Vietnam, and during the Vietnam conflict. We'll come back and talk about the village of My Lai. Terrible, terrible catastrophe. Regardless, Office of War Information comes knocking on Hollywood's door and goes, we have seen your growth, we have seen your influence, your power, etc. Right? We are in the golden age of cinema in the late 1930s. I mean, Hollywood is veritably printing money. They cannot make enough movies to satisfy the American public, and the Office of War Information comes and asks them to make pro-war movies. What in any other country you and I would call propaganda, right? We rarely want to talk about our own production of information as propaganda, but it was straight propagandistic attempt to sway public opinion, and without question, it was the most influential movement to get American sentiment towards supporting America's involvement in the European front, right? The Japanese did something rather radical to get us involved in Pacific realm, right? But European front was a much more difficult cause. So we think, when thinking about the government, right, this is from the government, working with, trying to sway the tide of public sentiment, we often think about or categorize these movies under the generic, specific title, Why We Fight, because one of the famous directors of the day, Frank Capra, is asked to make these films, and the most famous of which are called the Why We Fight movies. And really, this is a statement, right? This is why we fight, right? So let's check out a little documentary, short little documentary clip about why we fight. From the Why